Hi there, you're listening to the Hellenistic Age Podcast, Episode 115, The Third Punic War, Delenda Est. Across a period of nearly 5 decades, the Roman Republic emerged out of the horrors of the Second Punic War to become the uncontested hegemon of the Mediterranean world, defeating and eventually destroying the Antigonid dynasty in Macedonia, while forcing the mighty Seleucids in Asia to bend the knee on numerous occasions. By the late 150s BC, no power on the continents of Europe, Asia, or Africa could seriously consider itself equal to the might of the Roman legions. Yet this did not seem so apparent to the Romans themselves, for the ghost of Hannibal Barca continued to haunt many influential figures within the Republic, enough to drive them to zealously pursue a policy of destruction against their North African rivals. In this two-part series, we will cover the causes and controversies of the Third Punic War, the final bloody chapter in a century of conflicts between Rome and Carthage, and discuss what sort of consequences this had for the future of the Roman Republic as they were poised to consolidate their hold over much of the known world. In contrast to the Second Punic War, we find ourselves relying on a limited number of sources. The chief account of the Third Punic War comes from the historian Appian during the 2nd century AD, as part of his broader history of Rome's foreign conflicts. Ironically, despite being a direct eyewitness to the events and closely tied to its key players, Polybius's history is woefully fragmented, though we may be certain that Appian relied on it heavily when constructing his own narrative. But to understand why events transpired the way they did, we must go back several years earlier to just after the Battle of Zama and the surrender of Carthage in 201. As per the terms arranged between Scipio Africanus and Hannibal, Carthage was shackled with an indemnity of 10,000 silver talents to be paid to Rome in annual installments of 200 talents for the next 50 years. This was certainly a sizable amount owed, but it was neither too burdensome, as we shall learn, nor too harsh, given the extent of suffering inflicted on the Italian countryside by Hannibal's armies. It was more a symbolic gesture, a perpetual reminder of the Carthaginian submission to Rome that was not to be forgotten so easily. Carthage had been allowed to retain its independence when it came to its internal governance, but every other term, being forbidden to wage war outside Carthaginian territory, while also requiring Roman approval to wage war on their own soil, and the surrendering of most of its fleet and elephants, was put in place to prevent Carthage from seriously challenging Roman supremacy ever again. As Rome engaged in a series of wars in the Greek East, the Carthaginians were left to cope with their new status as a demilitarized power, and chose to dedicate their efforts towards an economic recovery. Before his departure from the city in 195, Hannibal Barca initiated a series of reforms to improve the city's finances. They were extremely unpopular among many of the Punic aristocracy, who had allegedly embezzled from the state treasury, but they allowed the broader citizenry to have a moment's respite to provide the first payments to the Romans. After Hannibal's flight from the city, this left the Carthaginians in a better position. True, they no longer had any overseas territories to draw upon for resources, such as Spanish silver or Sicilian grain, but luckily for them, the Second Punic War spared most of their heartlands. North African soil was famously productive, and the widely respected farming methods of Punic agricultural treatises enabled them to turn the area into a breadbasket. This in turn expanded their capacity as a trading partner and brought in great amounts of revenues. Being a highly predatory environment, it was almost unthinkable for any society in the ancient Mediterranean to forgo an active military force. In the long term, Carthaginian demilitarization was to be part of its downfall. But in the short term, this enabled them to avoid shouldering the burden of maintaining an army or navy for decades, allowing state expenditure to instead go towards other avenues. One of these was the city's Kothon harbor, built in the early 2nd century BC, an enormous undertaking that saw the digging of an artificial port designed around a circular ring of inner and outer docks, reportedly with a capacity of holding 220 ships, the vast majority being mercantile in function. The Carthaginians faithfully adhered to their promise when it came to providing Rome aid during their conflicts with the Hellenistic kingdoms by supplying the legions with enormous amounts of grain. 400,000 bushels during the Second Macedonian War, 1 million bushels in the Antiochian War, and 1.5 million bushels in the Third Macedonian War. This all is a clear indication of Carthage's successful economic transformation, made even more apparent when, in 191, the Carthaginians announced to the Romans that they were ready to pay off the remaining balance of the indemnity, amounting to 8,000 silver talents, in one lump sum as part of their aid in the war against Antiochus III. The Senate declined, though whether this was out of appreciation or a hard-nosed refusal to let the Carthaginians so easily shrug off their humiliation is left up to the reader to interpret. Carthage was not the only North African power to be doing exceptionally well during much of the 2nd century, as we find the United Kingdom of Numidia flourishing under the reign of King Massinissa. For his alliance with the Romans, Massinissa was rewarded with the kingship over the entirety of the Numidians, a position he would occupy for an astonishing 53 years. Under his jurisdiction, Numidia was transformed into an agricultural and military powerhouse, with several cities established, including the king's royal capital of Cirta and the settlement of Thuga, modern Tabursuk in Tunisia. Given the long-standing connections between Punic and Numidian elites, such relationships would continue uninterrupted as trade would encourage regular activity. The key difference is that Carthage historically was the dominant power over North Africa, but their limited capacity for warfare and Rome's favorable attitude towards Massinissa was too convenient of an opportunity to pass up on, and the king was eager to exploit it. As early as 193, Massinissa seized the region of Emporia along the Gulf of Hammamet in northeastern Tunisia, taking advantage of the factional strife of Carthage as it grappled with Hannibal Barca's involvement in the Antiochian War. Punic and Numidian embassies both approached the Senate asking for arbitration to settle the matter, and while Rome officially abstained from deciding in any one side's favor, this did little but confirm Massinissa's right to keep it. According to Polybius, this set a precedent that was to follow for the next few decades, as he believed the Senate was inherently prejudiced against the Carthaginians even when the party at fault was obvious. In 182, the Numidian kings seized Carthaginian territory on the long-winded claim of inheritance going back to before the Second Punic War, and yet again the Senate deferred to no judgment. 10 years later, Massinissa captured another 70 towns and fortresses from Carthaginian soil, charges that were denied by his son, Prince Gulusa. But in this instance, the Romans agreed with the Punic ambassadors that this was an unlawful act and demanded their return, though they made sure to shower the king with plenty of honors to keep him happy. In 170, Gulusa took his revenge by directly accusing the Carthaginians of conspiring to betray the Republic and ally with King Perseus of Macedon to supply him with ships. The gap in Book 43 of Livy's history cuts off the Senate's response to this claim, and it may be doubtful whether it actually was taken seriously at all, but it certainly would not have helped their attitudes given the stress of the Third Macedonian War that was on the immediate horizon. Carthage demonstrated its loyalty by providing an even larger amount of grain for the legions in Macedonia, but perhaps the shadow of doubt cast itself over many of the senators. In 153-152, another Roman delegation was sent to North Africa to investigate the dispute between Massinissa and the Carthaginians, but this time it would be headed by none other than Cato the Elder. Like Massinissa, Cato was one of the last of the generation who fought in the Second Punic War, and by the time of his visit he was pushing past 80 years old. Prior to this visit, he seemed to have expressed little interest in Punic affairs and believed Carthage to be an impoverished backwater. His expectations were turned upside down when he saw how the city was flourishing, its markets filled with goods, the citizenry populous and well-fed, and, allegedly, weapons being accumulated in great quantities. To some, this would be a testament of Carthaginian resilience and adaptability to the circumstances placed upon them. In Cato's eyes, this was a nightmare, and a sign of potential resurgence of their great foe. The terror of Hannibal's marauding army was something that most Romans of his day had never experienced, perhaps only hearing tales told by their parents or grandparents, but much of Cato's young adult life was defined by the conflict with Carthage, having witnessed it from beginning to end. In his maturity, he watched, and participated, in Rome's rise to uncontested master of the Mediterranean. For all the problems this came with in the wars of the East, of which Cato was not shy of being vocal about, the possible Punic threat to their imperium was intolerable. As soon as he returned to Rome, Cato was determined to bring about the destruction of Carthage. According to the sources, Cato would famously end each of his speeches urging this course of action, often paraphrased by modern historians as the declaration Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed. In one noteworthy incident as relayed by Plutarch and Pliny the Elder, Cato is said to have stood on the floor of the Senate and revealed from his toga a large fig. While all in attendance agreed that it was certainly an impressive-looking fruit, the elder statesman claimed that it was purchased a mere 3 days earlier from the Carthaginian markets, proof of the city's potential, and a warning of how their once mighty enemy was only a few days away by boat. Whether Cato actually purchased the fig or simply picked it up from his vast agricultural estates, the point was made clear to his fellow senators. A crisis started to emerge in 151. Appian suggests that by this time there were 3 dominant factions within Carthage, one that supported the Romans, led by Hanno the Great, one that was a democratic party led by Hamilcar the Samnite and Carthalo, and lastly one that was a pro-Numidian party headed by Hannibal the Starling. In 153-152, the democratic Carthaginians led a raid against the Numidians in retaliation for Massinissa encroaching upon their territory, fed up after years of harassment. This prompted the visit by Cato and the other Roman delegates in 152, where they simply deferred that Massinissa would hold on to all previous territory. Furious over the lack of support, Hamilcar and Carthalo convinced the Carthaginian Senate to banish Hannibal and the pro-Numidians out of the city in 151. These men went and complained to Massinissa, who dispatched his sons Gulussa and Micipsa to demand that the exiles be allowed to return home. Both princes were refused entry at the gates of the city, then were attacked by a mob of angry Carthaginians led by Hamilcar, killing several of their attendants and driving them back to Cirta. Massinissa did not respond well to his sons' lives being put in danger, and so he set out with his army to besiege the town of Oroscopa, which he had long coveted anyways. For the first time since the Battle of Zama, the Carthaginians mobilized an armed force numbering 25,000 infantry and 400 cavalry, led by the commander Hasdrubal. They were supported by 2 deserting Numidian nobles and their own large body of horsemen. But their first encounter with the royal army saw the Carthaginians chasing Massinissa into the wilderness, until they reached an area where water and food were in no great abundance, a plain bordered by craggy hills. Here both sides encamped for the night, unwilling to engage with each other until the dawn of the next day. At an astonishing 88 years of age, King Massinissa would participate in the battle by commanding and fighting from horseback, much the same as he did against the armies of Hannibal all those years ago. Watching from the heights was Scipio Aemilianus, who had been dispatched to the king to request elephants for the war effort in Spain, and observe both armies in action. The Punic force was absolutely devastated during the battle, and when they retreated to their camp, Massinissa ordered that it be surrounded with a circumvallation, intending to starve them into submission. Hasdrubal resisted surrendering, but his men suffered through horrific conditions, being forced to boil leather for food after going through the supplies and pack animals, along with pestilence and exposure to the elements. After many days of hardship, a settlement was negotiated with the Numidian king that allowed the survivors to depart if they promised to pay an indemnity of 5,000 talents of silver across 50 years. Though his father was the one who made the arrangement, Prince Gulussa was still bitter over the attack that kick-started the war, and so he broke the truce by butchering most of the remaining Carthaginians, and only a handful, including Hasdrubal, managed to make it back to the city alive out of the entire force that set out. The first military expedition of the Carthaginians had ended in abject failure, but the act itself carried tremendous consequences. They had unabashedly broken the terms of the treaty by waging war in Africa, against one of Rome's allies no less, prompting the Senate to begin mobilizing an army for the purposes of an emergency, though they did not elaborate further what the emergency was. To appease the Romans, the Carthaginians condemned and exiled Hasdrubal, the commander of the Numidian expedition, and Carthalo the Democrat, then sent an embassy in 150 to give defense of their actions, protesting the attacks of Massinissa, while also half-heartedly criticizing their own citizens for being too hasty for war. A senator questioned why had the Carthaginians not preemptively condemned the guilty party before conducting a war to begin with, and now are apologizing because they lost that fight. But the Punic ambassadors could not answer. Nervously, they asked the Senate how they could make amends, but received the cryptic answer, "You must make it right with the Roman people." The Carthaginian assembly did not understand the request, and a second embassy walked away equally mystified after once again bringing up the question, only to be told that Carthage already knew exactly what ought to be done. Internally, the Senate mulled over its actions. As ever, Cato rallied the warhawks and finally convinced the majority that the cause was just, for the potential power of the Carthaginians to rise again as a military threat were already evident, even if they failed in their efforts to best the Numidians. Fragments of his speeches have come down to us, stressing the need to commit to their destruction. Quote, "The Carthaginians are already our enemies, for the man who prepares everything against me, so that he can make war whenever he wants, is already my enemy, even though he is not yet taking military action." End quote. In another portion, Cato emphasized the various crimes committed by their Punic neighbors across the last century of conflict. Quote, "Who are they who have often broken treaties? The Carthaginians. Who are they who have waged war with the severest cruelty? The Carthaginians. Who are they who have marred the face of Italy? The Carthaginians. Who are they who now ask for a pardon? The Carthaginians." End quote. Though some may have continued to push against it, most were committed. An official declaration of war was passed by the Senate and Comitia Centuriata, which allowed for the assembly of an army, numbering 80,000 infantry and 4,000 cavalry in the year 149, commanded by the consuls Marcus Manilius and Lucius Marcius Censorinus. All parts of Roman society were enthusiastic about the prospects, thus explaining the huge influx of recruits who sought to take part in the endeavor. Seeing the writing on the wall, the powerful city of Utica decided to abandon Carthage and openly defected to the Romans, giving them access to a nearby location to land only 11 miles away. Like Rome and the Sucii, Carthage was considered the most prominent of the many Phoenician settlements of Libya, the others bound to them as allies in treaties to serve their cause, and the change of heart of the Uticans was no doubt a complete shock. Out of desperation, more Punic ambassadors were sent to Rome to try and de-escalate the situation by offering an unconditional surrender. They were told that if they handed over 300 children of the nobility as hostages to the consul stationed in Sicily, then the Carthaginians would be allowed to keep their freedom, autonomy, and any African territory they possessed. This is at least what was told publicly, for Appian says that the consuls were given secret instructions to plan a crossing into Africa no matter what, and the Carthaginians themselves were justifiably suspicious of the Senate's intentions, since there was no guarantee of the hostages' safety, nor was there any mention of the city of Carthage itself. Yet there was little they could do but acquiesce to the demand, and all these youths were shipped off to Sicily as their parents wailed in grief at the harbor, not knowing that they would never see their children again. As planned, the Roman army then crossed the Mediterranean and landed at Utica to set up operations, to the horror of the Carthaginians who thought that the offering of their children would have been enough to stave off the invasion. Representatives of the city were sent to the camp of the consuls, who sat upon elevated chairs surrounded by the soldiers dressed in full kit to intimidate their Punic visitors. The ambassadors pled their case, inquiring what else they must do to secure peace. Censorinus instructed them to surrender all of their weapons, from swords and missiles to even their siege equipment, along with any armor they may have possessed. This was faithfully carried out, returning back to the camp with numerous wagons, which according to Polybius contained nearly 200,000 suits of armor, numerous javelins and arrows, and even 2,000 catapults. Then followed a collection of the leading Carthaginians, from its elders to the city's priests, who were once again met by Censorinus and given the following instructions. The consul decreed that, while the surrendering of their weapons and hostages was dutifully performed, there was one last demand of the Senate. The Carthaginians themselves could continue to live under their own laws, but were commanded to move their settlement inland by at least 15 kilometers, 10 miles, while the city of Carthage itself was to be razed to the ground. Many present fell to their knees in abject disbelief, and the gravity of this declaration cannot be understated. The sea was the source of Carthaginian prosperity and prestige for centuries. To exile them inland would leave them permanently deprived of their lifeblood. On the spiritual level, the city contained innumerable family tombs and temples, and while the Romans promised that they would leave them unharmed, and the Carthaginians could visit to make the appropriate sacrifices, their promises so far had counted for little, leaving behind a gaping hole in the fabric of their society that may well never recover from. The walk back to their mother city was punctuated by silence among the ambassadors. Its populace had anxiously gathered along the walls, waiting for their return and what news they brought. But even without a word spoken to them, they could see that it was bad. On the Carthaginian Senate floor, the forlorn envoys announced the Roman ultimatum, and in response, they were set upon by the enraged citizenry and lynched. Soon this violence extended to the leading Carthaginians who previously tried to argue cooperation with Rome, along with any unlucky Italian traders who were still inside the city. Though widespread anarchy seemed to have been unleashed, what had been terror had been replaced with fury and a newfound determination. Even if all seemed lost, the remaining members of the Carthaginian Senate chose to go to war with Rome, rather than submit themselves to a slow demise. How did things come to be this way? Rome was the chief aggressor, that much is certain. But we need to look deeper beyond this to understand their rationale for choosing to push the Carthaginians to the brink of destruction. Unlike the First and Second Punic War, we are missing much of Polybius' explanation behind the outbreak of the Third Punic War, despite being a direct eyewitness to those events. In the Polybian schematic of warfare, there are three elements of its origin: the beginning, the deciding action that inaugurates the war, then the pretext, the reason cited by the parties going to war, lastly, a cause, the actual root of the conflict. From what fragments that we have, there is no explicit mention of those elements, though Polybius himself promises quite early in his work how he would give the true cause. We might be able to reconstruct from details using the surviving sources, which undoubtedly rely on Polybius to some extent. Both Appian and Plutarch state that the principal actor in pushing the Romans to war was Cato the Elder, particularly following his visit to Carthage in 152, where he witnessed its prosperity and driven to act. Cato was a respected member of the Senate, and his opinion held great sway, so much so that many of his fellow senators were convinced to fight against the Carthaginians as early as 152. But Appian, relying on Polybius, states that they needed to wait for a proper pretext before playing their hand, as they were deeply concerned about making sure they appeared the just party. Such a pretext might be found in the conflict between Carthage and Numidia, violating the Treaty of 201, which prohibited the Carthaginians from waging war against Rome's allies, or without its consent, thus compelling the Romans to assemble their army. The crossing of the army into Africa may be counted as the war's beginning, which prompted the Carthaginians to offer a complete surrender to de-escalate the situation. But the Romans persisted, and thus led to a series of ever-increasing demands that, ultimately, would have been unacceptable in almost any circumstances, leading to the response of the Carthaginian people in pursuit of war. Are we to believe that the Romans were seriously concerned about their own survival? No doubt that the invasion of Hannibal Barca left a deep scar in the Roman psyche, given the sheer number of military casualties and civilian deaths, and Rome had a very long memory on which to nurse grudges. There is no way that even with all of its accumulated wealth, Carthage could have posed a serious threat to Rome's military supremacy. As we saw in 150, the expedition against Massinissa ended in complete disaster and nearly wiped out the army of 25,000 Carthaginians, a sizable amount of its fighting capacity. Perhaps there is another explanation. Some suggest that the part of the enthusiasm behind the war can be traced to contemporary conflicts that the Republic was engaged in, chief among them the fighting with the Celtiberians in Hispania. Since taking ownership of the former Barcid holdings in Iberia, the Romans faced a great deal of difficulty in keeping things under control. After a 25-year period of relative peace following the First Celtiberian War in 179, widespread violence among the Celtiberian and Lusitanian communities erupted in 155. In 154, the praetor Quintus Fabius Nobilior was beaten by the Celtiberians in a battle that claimed 6,000 Roman lives, then a second that killed another 4,000. In Lusitania, warlords in the region slaughtered another 15,000 men in ambushes and raids, including one of the Aediles. Decades of campaigns during and after the Hannibalic War molded the Roman legions into pound for pound the most effective fighting force in the Mediterranean. Yet the veterans of those campaigns were long dead, and the armies in Spain suffered defeats that greatly shook the morale of the Roman people. As a result of this, the Senate found it difficult to recruit men for the legions and to serve in high command, as nobody wanted to deal with the hard campaigning that would inevitably follow. The lone exception was Scipio Aemilianus, son of Aemilius Paulus, the victor of Pydna, and adoptee of the Scipiones. Having already made somewhat of a name for himself, he volunteered to take part in the expedition as tribune to quell the Spanish rebellions, and earned great renown for doing so, even managing to slay a barbarian nobleman in single combat. Like his adoptive grandfather Scipio Africanus, his experience in dealing with the Celtiberians would prove to be invaluable, as it pertained to the approaching war against the Carthaginians. While the revolts in Spain would be put down, the chance to destroy a long-hated foe would be the appropriate step to send a message to any who dared question the might of Rome, and a sufficient morale boost for the Roman peoples. Conversely, not all agree that the destruction was to the benefit of their military prowess. Scipio Nasica Corculum, another Scipio who played an important role in the Battle of Pydna, argued against the notion, believing that by sparing the Carthaginians, they would have a common foe to keep the Romans on their toes, thus preserving their own fighting spirit out of fear of becoming too complacent. Another argument points towards a more materialistic cause, the desire for plunder and land. The wars against Macedon and the Seleucid Empire were extremely lucrative, leading to massive indemnities imposed on the defeated parties, along with plenty of loot and enslaved captives to distribute among the soldiers. There had not been any on that scale for nearly 20 years, and the later conflicts in Spain had not proved to be the cash cows that many legionaries hoped for. Though Polybius mentions how Spanish silver mines were producing a sizable amount of revenues by the mid-2nd century, this was not something that the soldiers could take advantage of. Yet the wealth of Carthage and the fertility of their farmlands were great enough to intimidate the likes of Cato, and many Romans seemed to recognize the potential opportunity for enrichment. Unlike the recruitment drives for Spain, there was a huge influx of volunteers to take part in the invasion of North Africa. For as much as genuine patriotism may have played a part, there must have been some confidence that they would have come out wealthier than when they enlisted. An anecdote by Plutarch goes even further, recounting a dinner party hosted by a Roman equestrian around the time of the conflict, who served a city-shaped honey cake for his guests, declaring that it was named Carthage, and that it was theirs to plunder. There is a degree of truth to this picture, but it is worth pointing out that by the end of the war, the lands of Carthage were left more or less abandoned for nearly a century without any real investment by the Roman state, and the plunder taken was not particularly sizable. In a rather lengthy fragment, Polybius describes the response of the Greeks who observed Rome's conduct towards the Carthaginians. Some applauded the Romans for taking the necessary steps to defend their empire by wiping out a longtime rival. There was little love lost between the Greeks and Carthaginians, as the centuries of conflicts between the Punic and Hellenic cities of Sicily were well known to those on the mainland. However, there was something unpleasant about the manner Rome pursued the war that rubbed some people the wrong way. The Romans had a reputation for being fairly direct when it came to diplomacy and warfare, but their actions felt a tad underhanded. Polybius himself seems to disagree, believing that Rome took the appropriate diplomatic precautions to declare war against Carthage despite ostensibly believing them to be the aggressor. While this may seem to us rather contradictory, it must be reminded that Polybius and many others of his time believed that expansionism was a desirable goal to pursue for the state, so Rome's ambitions were not a problem in of themselves. This passage may be the key then to understanding the true reason that Rome went to war with Carthage. While the other factors like loot, moralizing, and claims of treaty violations may have been part of the equation, what the Romans like Cato the Elder sought was not to protect the safety of Rome itself, but rather the security of its foreign interests and the ability to extend its imperium. In 151, Carthage delivered the final payment of its 50-year indemnity owed to Rome starting at the end of the Second Punic War. With the conclusion of the payments, Carthage may very well have believed that they were no longer as beholden to the terms of the treaty as dictated by the Romans. It is probably no coincidence that a Carthaginian attack on Numidia took place when Rome faced a crisis in its Spanish holdings in 153, and the Greater Expedition followed in the same year as the final indemnity payment. That endeavor ended in disaster, but in the Roman mindset, this showed that the Carthaginians were testing the waters for independent activity, which might jeopardize, or at least hinder, potential avenues for expansion in Africa. In my opinion, this was Cato's driving motivation, for the man who saw the Republic at its lowest point in his youth, witnessed its rise to the dominant power of the Mediterranean as a middle-aged man, and now was a senior member of that state, he cynically concluded that the best way for Rome to maintain its position was to annihilate the lone rival that once challenged it. Cruel and calculating? Absolutely. But in a world of might makes right, Cato's vindictive attitudes found few critics among those in his day, and the Romans were exceptionally concerned about engineering the situation where they would appear the righteous cause. As much as the odds appeared to be stacked against them, the Carthaginians had a newfound resolve to fight down to the last man, woman, and child than give up so easily to the Romans. Next time, we will cover the final days of the ancient city of Carthage, as the Third Punic War begins in earnest.